Inside and out, everyone you know has got them. Your mom and dad and all your friends. Enjoy your scars, scars, scars. Enjoy your scars.
Welcome to Bearing Scars. I'm your host, Michael Ortel. On this podcast, we peel back the visage on the lives of people you know, or think you know, and tell their real story in their own words. Our previous guests have been hyper honest about their scars and how many of them have been self-inflicted. Their stories are real, raw, and honest. I urge you to pick up your phone and click the plus icon on your screen so you don't miss an episode of this important series of interviews. If you're having a hard time finding the plus icon or how to follow the show, simply send me an email to mike@bearingscars.com and I'll send a response on how to follow our show. I'm asking you to follow our show for a simple reason. Because while we will never charge you to listen to these impactful stories, and we aren't making any profits from it, we would like to know we're making a real difference. By simply clicking the plus button and following us, you're affirming what our real-life audio autobiographers are sharing is important and impactful. As always, thank you for your trust. On today's episode of Bearing Scars, we're going to do something a little different. Today's guest is someone you may have already seen. Heather Rovette is the main character in the highly rated Amazon Prime documentary Rom-Con, Who the F is Jason Porter? In this documentary, Heather recounts her experience with a serial con man. In this Amazon Prime documentary, viewers worldwide have seen how this one man was able to take so much from so many women. He preyed on their desire for love and gave them nothing but anguish and depleted bank accounts. But on Bearing Scars, we're going to go beyond the polished documentary and delve into the life of the woman who became the unwitting star of it. And, as you'll discover, one of Toronto's most successful businesswomen was not just a victim once, but twice. Let's meet Heather Rovette. Heather Rovette, welcome to Bearing Scars. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I mean, most people who are listening to this podcast or watching this podcast on YouTube have seen Rom-Con, but what we want to do is really get to know Heather, the person. So the question we ask everybody, first question, every podcast, Heather, what did you want to be when you grew up?
That's a very good question. I think when I was really little, I wanted to be a fashion designer. And I remember one year for my birthday, I got this really cool gift that were these fashion plates. There were these pieces of plastic and you could put like a skirt and a blouse and trace over it and then color it in. I wanted to do that. Simultaneously, I thought at one point maybe I wanted to be an actress because I always would be in the camp musicals and get a pretty big part. And obviously I'm a little bit of an extrovert. So that was something I wanted to do. If when I was growing up had, social media influencer been a job or something like that, I would have been all over that idea. But from my earliest wantings as a child were always something creative, whether fashion or acting, and neither of those really manifested, although my first career, I was a wardrobe stylist in TV and film before I became a real estate broker. But
any shows?
I'll go with answer A. I would say the one show that people would know that I worked on for a few seasons was Degrassi, The Next Generation.
Okay.
With a very young, before he was famous, Drake, when he was still
nice.
Aubrey.
Nice. I remember watching the first series when it was just junior high.
Yeah. So I had friends in the original one, probably back in the 80s. And then in the 2000s, when I was working in TV and film, they revamped it and they called it Degrassi, I think The Next Generation. Nice. It was actually a very cool show to work on. We had a whole lot where you drove in and it looked like you were driving into a high school.
Oh, that's neat.
And that was part of the studio was like part high school. And then there was like another soundstage with a shopping mall, and then a part that was supposed to look like downtown Toronto. It was neat. It was, and we would shoot on location. But I worked on that show for a few seasons as the assistant costume designer, which basically meant I shopped a lot.
How did you get into doing that as a profession?
Well, to be honest, I wanted to be a fashion designer, then I wanted to be an actress. And then I went off to university and I started taking some really interesting courses, some in world religion. And, you know, when you're at university, the first year, if you just take sort of like a general arts degree, you're learning philosophy, you're learning history. Well, there was a program at my university called International Development Studies, which essentially, had I gone on to pursue that as a career, one would probably work for an NGO or a charity, and you'd be involved with an international organization. I thought it would be really cool to take that and couple it with journalism and become an international foreign correspondent and go and cover stories from around the world. So I studied international development, and then I applied to journalism school, and I didn't get in, but I went to university on the east coast of Canada at a school called Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a really great little city. After I didn't get into journalism school, I moved back to Toronto and I started interning at a magazine. And then I got my first job as a kind of like a production assistant at a small cable channel within the City TV Chum City network of channels and shows. And a girlfriend of mine called me up and she said, "Hey, Heath, I've been hired to do a low budget Canadian Film Centre film, and I need an assistant. I can't really pay you, but I can feed you and teach you everything you want to know. Do you want to come work with me?" And I was like, "Yep, done." And this would have been the late 90s. And that's a time when the Canadian dollar was, like it is today, so low that it attracted a lot of American productions to come up to Canada. And that's when I think we got the dub Hollywood of the North. Then I got a break and got hired on as the buyer for a huge TV series that was called, it was Peter Benchley's Amazon. And this would have been the late 90s. And it was kind of like that TV show Lost. It was, the idea was like this plane crash went down in the Amazon. And it was really neat from a wardrobe perspective because we had an entire department. I mean, I felt like I was being paid to go to school. We had a department with milliners and like people who would come and make leather shoes because we had to dress all the Aboriginal people from the Amazon. We had hat makers who would do these crazy feather headdresses, and we had breakdown artists who would make the clothes from the plane crash survivors every week look older and older and older until they miraculously found some suitcase in the middle of the Amazon and they got new designer clothes. But it was a really cool experience. And from that, I worked on a lot of Canadian television, some pretty lame cop shows, and then a lot of kids stuff. So
you had mentioned that when you got out of college and you're trying to find yourself, you're still with your folks, probably still living with your folks at the time. How was home life growing up?
I had a pretty idyllic life in many ways. I mean, I grew up not really wanting for anything. Like I have an older brother who's only 18 months older. So he was one grade above me. So our friends were always like one big gang. Mm-hmm. My sister is 2.5 years younger. So the grade difference was more, but we all got along. My mom worked her entire career, so we had a lot of nannies or housekeepers. So in a way, our house by high school was the best place to be because there was very little parental supervision. But we would go on family holidays. In the summer, I was either at summer camp for a month and then our family cottage. So I never spent time in the city. I had a really pretty great life, not to ruin like the rest of our conversation, but when my life blew up, I remember talking to my oldest, dearest friend. Her name's Allison. And she said to me when I told her what was going on, she said, Heath, we didn't grow up knowing people like him because we grew up in this very nice upper middle class home where, you take people on their word. I was brought up to trust people. I was brought up to see the good in the world. So I also have always been a little entrepreneurial. And so
Yeah, I can tell. Yeah.
I think it was in 2000. In 2000, I launched an online clothing store called divadigs.com. And it was all different local, independent, Toronto-based designers. So I had people who made dresses and sweaters and bags and really funky, cool stuff. And I had this really cool web. I was so ahead of my time. I was so ahead of what online shopping was, because in 2000, no one was really doing it. But I had this online clothing website that when you went to the homepage, there was she looked like a cartoon, but her body was actually based on a mannequin, like we call them Judy's. So her body was a mannequin. And I would take pictures of all the clothes, and then I had a web designer design it so you could click on this designer's sweater and match it with that designer's skirt, and then throw on a purse so you could dress up the cartoon girl to see what the outfits were going to look like. And simultaneously, I had this whole, I guess, which would have been a blog, a whole ongoing story of who this cartoon girl was in her life and the adventures that she was living through. Very Sex and the City in a way. And I did that for a few years, but the business never kind of took off, partly because back then people still wanted brick and mortar, and the whole while still working in TV and film. And I think it was like one night in late 2009, I just was burnt out. And I remember leaving a shopping mall downtown, and this was even before everything was automated. And I'm at the little window paying my parking ticket as I'm leaving, and the parking attendant was like, "Good night, Heather." And I was like, the fact that he knew my name, I just broke down and lost it. And I was like, there's got to be something more I can do with my life. Like, I've tried this business that didn't really go how I wanted, but what else could I do? And then it was talking to my sister-in-law, who said, you know, you've already bought a condo. Like, you'd probably be a really great real estate agent. The real estate market in Toronto at that point, sort of like the beginning of the condo boom, I got very lucky early in my career. And the first sale I ever did was, you know, for like a $1.1 million penthouse. And that person happened to be the CEO of a commercial real estate company. And he just started feeding me work. And it was great. It was a great time. Like, once I got into real estate, I, within 2 years of being in the industry, became a broker. I was the first agent in the city of Toronto to shoot a lifestyle video to sell a property. And that got me a bit of notoriety. I was, you know, written up in a couple local newspapers and an industry publication. And it was a neat time. Like, I definitely, probably from 2010 until COVID hit, was on a very good trajectory with my real estate career. And I genuinely enjoyed it. You know, it was a really fun industry. And then I partnered up with somebody, and we were on fire. Like, we did really, really well, and you get very well compensated for it. And I genuinely enjoyed it. But it's very hard to go through something like I went through and find the same kind of joy in that when I feel I now have a bigger purpose in life.
2018, before anything just came up and smacked you with reality of how some people are in life, what did you think you were going to be doing when you were 50?
Real estate. I always thought it'd be cool to work more on small scale developments. Mm-hmm. Like, right now in Toronto, I live in a house that was built in, I think, 1893. And a developer bought this house in the late 90s, and it was a big mansion that they then carved into 6 luxury apartments. And I love that idea of taking something old and mixing it with something new. But I also love, you know, from the ground up, building something that is really well designed and really thought out. Mm-hmm. The big towers, you know, you look at some of the floor plans and you know it's an afterthought because they're just trying to use up all the space. Mm-hmm. Having owned and renovated my own condos in the past, because I've owned 2 condos and renovated them both, and both times sold them for the highest price per square foot in the building. When done right, you can take a small space and transform it into something quite incredible.
And during this time frame, when you were having all this great success in real estate, you're by yourself. I mean, you're dating a little bit, you're by yourself, but you have a little buddy with you, right? Who was your little buddy?
That little buddy was Baxter. Mm-hmm. And I was actually Baxter's second mom. So Baxter was my longtime real estate partner's dog. He got Baxter. And then I think when Baxter was about 4, him and his wife split up. I ended up with their dog. I had 2 dogs prior to Baxter. I had Lily and Edgar. They were my first 2 dogs, and I loved them so much. And we lived right downtown, and they were great. And they lived to be just shy of 15, both of them. And Edgar, I had to put Edgar to sleep 6 months to the day that later after Lily, and I was just heartbroken. So I decided to take a bit of time off of being a dog mom. But then all of a sudden, this little guy, and I never thought I would be a little dog mom, but Baxi needed a home. And so I said to them, I'm like, I'll take him for now, but I'll find him, I'll take him, and then I'll try and find him a home. After having that little guy for a weekend, I was so hooked on him. He was just, honestly, he was the best thing in the world. And
it's interesting because every career field, Baxter, everything you've done up until this point was giving to other people. You were giving other people, making them look good. You were helping people find a home to make a happy home and a happy life for themselves. You were helping little Baxter have a happy life after a divorce with his other mom. So everything you were doing was for other people. And then when you really finally wanted to do something for yourself, you wanted to invest for yourself, and you wanted to invest in your own happiness. And when you went that route, a couple of calamitous things happened. And we're going to talk about both of those when we come back to Bearing Scars. Today's episode of Bearing Scars is sponsored by the Churchill Strategy Group. In today's complex world, your voice needs to be heard, from City Hall to the halls of the White House. Whether you're navigating local regulations, state policy, or federal legislation, Churchill Strategy Group's strategic insight opens doors, builds coalitions, and turns challenges into victories. Visit them online at churchillstrategygroup.com.
Scars, scars, scars. Enjoy your scars.
Welcome back to Bearing Scars. Today we're with Heather Rovette, and she has, up until this point in her life, 2018, 2019, had a charmed existence. She was able to care for people, care for them in ensuring that they're dressed well for a movie role, that they're living in a great place, even that she is taking care of adopted pets. She's had 3 adopted pets up to that point, right, Heather?
Mm-hmm.
3 adopted.
3 rescues. Well, 2 rescues and a rehome.
2 rescues and a rehome. And so you're really taking care of a whole lot of other people. You decide at this point, I'm a grown-up, I'm going to invest. And what did you invest in, and how did that big investment go for you?
So I'll never forget this guy. I was at a social function in Toronto, and I used to back in the day be very social and would go to galas and parties. And I was at this party, and this very well-dressed, cool-looking younger Asian guy came up to me, and we started chatting. And he asked me what I did, and I said, I'm a real estate broker. And he said, oh, a lot of my clients are real estate brokers. I'm like, oh, what do you do? And he said, oh, I'm in finance. I'm a personal wealth manager. I was like, oh, cool. I said, that's interesting. I do have some RSPs and some investments, but it's something I've never really known that much about. And we started talking, and we probably exchanged cards, go out for coffee a week later. He lives near me. This guy's, now what I know about scammers and con men and whatever, he's, a charmer. And I start off small. I was like, okay, I can go with like 15,000, I think was my first round of investment with him. And this guy was good. He had a business card, a website. He told me he was going to invest the bulk of my stuff in the S&P 500. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. And he basically said, with what's going at this time in the world, it was, it would have been, I guess, 2016, 2017. It was Brexit was all over the news. So he was convinced that, you know, if we play our cards right, he can take this amount of money and within like 3 to 6 months, it'll double. And of course I get stars in my eyes. I'm like, double? I mean, my 15 can become 30. Like, that's a really good ROI. Cool. Let's do it. And I would meet with him and he would show me how my money was doing. I'm like, this is great. Now, simultaneously, this guy's like befriending me more and more. And, you know, we're spending time together. And I thought he was really sweet. And, you know, I even wrote him a letter of recommendation because he was moving money. He wanted to move money to an offshore bank account in Belize. And he needed a letter of reference from some clients. Like, I don't know how much of this was really true or happening, but I was happy to oblige. And then I sold my first condo downtown. And he knew that I was doing this, and I had a huge check from the proceeds, the profits. And he was like, you know, if you invest it with me, like any scammer, at this point he had me. I was comfortable with him. We were meeting quarterly. He was showing me. So I was like, I'm going to take a chance on you. And I said, but I'm going to need this money back because the place I moved into, I knew I was going to renovate. And I said, you can have this for, 6 months, but I'm going to need some money out because I'm going to be using the money for the renovation. And, when push came to shove and I'd started to plan the renovation and I picked all my finishes and I put some deposits down, but then it was go time and I needed my money. And when I needed my money, he basically disappeared.
Physically disappeared or just started ignoring you?
Well, it started with ignoring me, and then he said, stop leaving me mean voicemails. Like, I'm under a lot of pressure. I was like, I don't care if I sound mean. Like, this is my money. Like, what the F is going on? And then I started, to be honest, it just went from bad to worse with him too. And I think because so much other bad stuff happened, some of those memories are a little, it's not that I've blocked them out. It's just so much other stuff has happened. But essentially when push came to shove and I needed my money, this guy basically disappeared. And I remember just being like, oh my God, I have committed to this renovation. What am I going to do? And again, like, I thank my lucky stars every day for the family I come from. My parents did, at this point though, before I went to my parents, I maxed out my line of credit. I maxed out my credit cards. But I still was short. And I told my sister first about this Simon guy, how I couldn't find my money. And, so many little things happened, but then I finally had to go to my parents and they just were so upset for me. And I remember my dad I was crying so hard. He started crying because I really felt like a loser. I was just like, how it was $127,000 that was gone. And I just felt so sick to my stomach. And same time I was going through this realization was when the Bernie Madoff scandal came to light. And I remember listening to some of his victims and they were going on how they lost millions. And I was like, oh my God, like, this is terrible. But I always, there was part of me all through that time that knew, like, I'll make this money back. Yes, it's a hard pill to swallow. It's hard to save. But God, thank God I'm only 40 at the time. I think I was 43. I'm like, oh, at least I'm not 63. At least I'm not 73. Like, that's hard. Right. Mm-hmm. But somehow through some digging and, I became again a detective and found other victims and went to the police. And then it was one night in March, this guy's disappeared and a cop called me. And she told me about another victim who had lost a huge amount of money through this guy. And it would be many months later that he was finally arrested because the guy actually left the province and changed his name. And somehow he stupidly came back. And I guess there must have been a warrant out for him or a be on the lookout. And the guy got arrested and then he got thrown in jail. And so that would be my first experience with the criminal justice system.
He was put in jail around what time? Like what year?
So I remember getting that phone call in March. I think he was probably arrested. It was sometime in that late 2018, early 2019 that this guy had probably been arrested. And he was in jail. And I guess because he really is a loser and had no friends, he sat in jail for a long time and couldn't make bail. And I was subsequently trying to sue him civilly. I was trying to get a civil judgment against the guy, which I did get. But, you know, I've learned that
You're never going to get that. Yeah.
You know, the judge ordered restitution to the victims, but none of us ever saw a penny.
Wow. What did he do with the money, you think? What do you think he did with the money?
Well, I've thought about this, and it makes me so mad. And since being scammed twice and getting to know other survivors and reading more, and it's so prevalent now, financial scams, I don't know. I think he either really was trading my money unlicensed, because he really wasn't a licensed person at all. And maybe he did a bad trade and lost all my money, or he had his own Ponzi scheme happening where he, you know, took what he used from me to pay off somebody else he had scammed and, you know, was living that way. And it just all blew up and got to be too much, because these things always have a way of, you know, the truth always has a way of coming to light. So I think that's probably what happened. And at the end of the day, even if he could have just been using my $127,000 to live, to pay his rent, to buy some clothes, to look flashy, you know, it's not a lot of money. I've become friends with Cecilia, the main person from Tinder Swindler. And her, you know, when you think of that story, that her scammer, her con guy, was using all this money because he was living such a flashy lifestyle, right? Like this,
that's
like
the diamonds guy, right? The guy that pretended he was a diamond.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And he would fly around on private jets and stay in fancy hotels and buy designer clothes. So he was getting all her money to live that lavish lifestyle.
Which is part of a Ponzi, to show this is what you could have too. You know, you said you met him at an event and he showed up, he was dressed well. That could have been somebody else's money he used. How frustrating is it that you don't know what he did with the money?
Well, if I think about it now, that is quite frustrating. I wonder. And, you know, I would love to get some of my money back from him today. It would be great. I mean, I don't need it, but it would be nice. It would just be nice that it was so frustrating, because I remember when he pled guilty, there was, we were allowed, I was told like on a Friday that he's going to plead guilty and you're allowed to write a victim impact statement and come to court next week and read it. So my lawyer came with me to court, and, you know, it was one of the most frustrating days of my life. And ironically, I was with Jace at this time. And I remember Jace helped me write my victim impact statement.
Wow. Which
is so crazy to me. And Jace was so supportive of all of this through our whole relationship. So it's so funny. But I remember his mom came in and they gave I actually thought this guy Simon was Korean. He turned out he was Chinese. And his lawyer gave some sad story that, you know, he had a hard childhood, and his mom, who lives in Edmonton, Alberta, is a single mom and barely speaks English and worked so hard to raise him. But anyhow, the judge, in their infinite wisdom, transferred his probation from Ontario to Alberta, which is a few provinces over. And the Ontario cop that was supposed to liaison with his parole officer never did. And, you know, I tried to follow up on my own with his probation officer, and my lawyer tried to follow up with his probation officer, and we were told that that's a violation of his privacy.
Wow. It's an unfinished story.
Really is. That one's unfinished. And I think, you know, I've learned a lot of things in life. And after I went through the stuff with Jace, I did a lot of therapy, and I still go to therapy. And one of the things that my therapist and I often talk about is radical acceptance. And with the Simon and the money, it's that very idea. It's like, she would say, Heather, you don't have to like what happened, but you have to accept it happened. Mm-hmm. And you can apply that to so many things in life. So, yeah, you know, I'm in such a I've moved so beyond that sure, it would be great to like expose him and get more money. But for a long time too, I was like so many victims feel, it's very embarrassing to be scammed and conned, especially at that age and that much money. I was like, oh my God. But, I now know it's not just me. There's lots of people who this happens to.
So with the financial scam where you got caught up in that, where you got scammed, but you didn't get caught up in it, you were scammed. Other people were there giving victim impact statements.
No, I was the only victim
only
that actually
one.
showed up to read their statement, but other people read theirs. But as it turned out, the cop that called me several months before, who sort of was young and like was piecing it all together, because the way it works here in Toronto is if you lived in Toronto but lived in the East End and I live in the West End, if you had a crime to report, you would go to your local police and I would go to my local police. And it was almost like people were going all over the city, but nobody was connecting the dots until this one young woman, female officer, got on the case and she connected the dots. And so that woman who had gone to the police, what Simon had done was somehow he got this woman's bank card and was able to like call the bank and pretend he was her son. And he siphoned $250,000 out of her account. But the bank, because essentially it was their mistake because they didn't verify, she got her money back from the bank. She's the only one that got the money back. But there was at least 4 other victims. And I remember when the judge was reading out all of us, I was on the hook for like by far the most. Most people were more like 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. And then it was like 127 was my number. And the judge, he gave us equal restitution. Like he was like, you're going to have to pay everyone back this amount a month. Like it just made no sense. And even I remember the day in court, the Crown, who I met that day in the courtroom, he looked at me, he was like, oh, this judge, he's a softie. And I was like, what does that mean? I was like, great. And this judge kind of looked at Simon as a young man who made a mistake and has been sitting in a crappy jail cell for, over a year now, and feels like, okay, he's served enough time. He's a first-time offender. He'll do better on probation than he will sitting in a jail. And because he had no one else to vouch for him except his mother, he was able to go to a different province, and it all kind of fell to the wayside. And who knows where he is now? I hope he lives, I'm sure his life isn't great. He's either still scamming or he's just living a mediocre life.
Were the other victims women?
A couple were women, but there was also some men. So
you had mentioned that you had a new boyfriend at this point who helped you to write your victim impact statement after Simon had stolen your money from you. Tell me about the boyfriend that helped you.
Well, so the whole reason I needed my money from Simon was because I was renovating my condo. So I began the renovation probably, I think, mid-November. And I carried forward with the renovation and, managed to pull it off. And by mid to end of April, I was back in the condo. And like any renovation, I used this great company to do the cabinetry work in the kitchen and the washrooms. And, there were just a few things that they, after their installation that needed fixing. So I had the sales guy come look at what I thought needed fixing. And he said, oh, okay, yeah, we have a new service guy. His name's Jace. I'll pass your number on to him and he'll be in touch and he'll come fix everything. So that probably was sometime in June. A couple weeks later, it's July. It's Monday, July, I want to say 9th, 2018. And I'm lying in bed on a Monday morning and it's about 7:30 and my phone goes bing. I'm like, who's messaging me so early? And I read the message and it's Jace from the kitchen company. So a couple hours later, I open my front door and I wasn't expecting such a cute, ruggedly cute guy to show up. And so I let him in and he does, what he needs to do. And I find myself kind of making small talk with him and hovering around. And I offered to run out and I buy us some coffees. And when he finished, I asked him, I summoned my courage and I was like, could you help me do a couple other things? I still had to hang up the hooks and the towel bars and the toilet paper holders in the bathroom. And he was like, sure, no problem. So he helped me do some of that. And then he was like, he had to go. And we hadn't quite finished one of the towel bars. And I was like, I've got it. Don't worry. And I mean, long story short, because people can watch the documentary, I called him back. I ran out to the hardware store to get something, and I came back and I noticed on the kitchen island his big honkin' measuring tape. And I was like, oh, he left his measuring tape. So I called him and I said, you left your measuring tape. And by the way, I completely ruined putting up this towel bar. And he was laughing. He goes, I'm literally like 10, 15 minutes away. I can pop by and fix it. So he did. That led to us going out for lunch, which led to us texting and flirting, which led to a first date, which led to a relationship going from 0 to 100 within a couple weeks.
Wow.
And I used to think that because I'm a spiritual person who I believed was in touch with my intuition, I genuinely thought that the universe, that God had sent me Jace as compensation for being ripped off by Simon. I was like, you know what? I lost money, but I fell in love. Mm-hmm. And I was really in what I thought was love with somebody who I thought really loved me back. And to answer your question, I think it was in the fall of 2019 when Simon finally pled guilty. And I remember Jace helping me with my victim impact statement. And he even, had this great, he was like, he took the amount, the $127,000, and divided it by the amount of time Simon had spent in jail. And I remember in that statement saying, like, so Your Honor, Simon essentially has made this much money off of me for every day he sat in jail. And it was such a powerful way to look at it. And I would have never come up with that on my own, but the fact that's where Jace's mind went, I was like, now I know why. But what, it just is so effing ironic that, he knew. I told him on our very first lunch together about Simon and the money being stolen, and he probably sat there going, oh, this one's going to be putty in my hands.
Tell me something good.
On the next episode of Bearing Scars, we conclude this story by learning about the man some knew as Jace, others as Jason, and how he conned some of Canada's most successful female executives. More importantly, we'll learn how Heather became not just another victim, but the one who would finally put an end to his reign of romance-themed financial terror. Like and subscribe to see how Heather stopped the scam, survived, and has thrived.